She weaponized the HOA, turned my driveway into her personal parking lot, and mocked me for defending what was mine. The worst part? For too long, she got away with it. But not anymore. The first thing you should know about me is that I don't have the patience for nonsense, especially after a 24-hour shift at the firehouse. My name's Sherwin Alvarez, and when I come home, all I want is a quiet house, a cold drink, and a chance to shake off the exhaustion that clings to my bones. But that morning, as I turned onto my street, I saw something that made my already frayed nerves snap. A silver SUV was sitting smugly in my driveway, blocking my access like it had every right to be there. At first, I figured it was a mistake, a delivery driver, a lost visitor, but as I got closer, I saw no note, no hazard lights, nothing. Just a stranger's car claiming my space. I ground my teeth, gripping the steering wheel. My father, a 76-year-old stroke survivor, relied on me to get him to his medical appointments. This driveway was his only safe way in and out of the house. I pulled to the curb, took a deep breath, and left a polite note on the windshield. A small inconvenience, I thought. Just a misunderstanding. I had no idea this was only the beginning. The next morning, I stepped outside, hoping my note had done the trick. But instead of relief, I felt my stomach twist into a knot of pure rage. The SUV was still there. Not only that, but my neatly written note had been crumpled up and thrown into my yard, as if whoever owned this car was mocking me. I clenched my fists, pulse pounding in my ears. I had barely slept after my shift, and now, I was staring at a blatant act of disrespect on my own property. My father had an important physical therapy appointment in 2 hours, he needed his walker, he needed a clear path to the car, and instead, he was trapped because some entitled stranger decided my driveway was their personal parking space. I stormed across the street, my frustration boiling over into something dangerously close to outrage. I had a pretty good idea whose car it was. Karen Dorsey, our brand new HOA president, the type of woman who treated the neighborhood like her own kingdom, issuing citations for unsightly mailboxes and overgrown hedges, while bending every rule in her favor. I knocked hard on her door, jaw tight. Seconds later, it swung open, and there she stood, immaculately dressed, fake smile plastered on, arms crossed like I was the one inconveniencing her. "Ah, Sherwin," she said, voice dripping with insincerity. "What can I do for you?" I gestured to my driveway, barely able to keep my voice level. "Move your car, Karen. My father needs to leave for his appointment." Her smirk widened. "Oh, that's your issue. Well, you see, street parking is just so limited, and as HOA president, I have a lot of important business. I figured your driveway was just sitting there unused." My hands clenched at my sides. "Karen, this is my property. You can't just." She waved a dismissive hand. "If you really have a problem with it, file a complaint with the HOA. "Oh, wait, I run the HOA. Then, without another word, she shut the door in my face. I stood there, heart pounding with fury. This wasn't just a parking issue anymore. This was war. I spent the rest of the day stewing in frustration, unable to shake the smug look Karen had given me before slamming the door in my face. Every time I glanced out my window, there it was, her oversized SUV, still parked right in my driveway, taunting me. I should have been focusing on my father's health, making sure he was comfortable, but instead, I was forced to deal with the blatant disrespect of a woman who thought rules only applied to everyone else. By the time evening rolled around, I had decided to give her one last chance. I walked back across the street, taking a deep breath to keep my boiling temper in check, and knocked. Hard. This time, she took her sweet time answering. When the door finally opened, she was holding a wine glass in one hand and her phone in the other, looking like she had just finished laughing at a joke. Probably one at my expense. "Sherwin," she sighed, as if she were exhausted from my mere existence. "Back again. This is starting to feel like harassment." I took a deep breath, fighting the urge to snap. I'm not asking again, Karen. Move your car. She took a slow sip of wine, not even pretending to take me seriously. You know, I was talking to the board earlier, and it turns out there are some new HOA regulations regarding driveway maintenance. She waved a manicured hand toward my property. Yours looks a little neglected. I stared at her, disbelief twisting into something far darker. She wasn't just ignoring me, she was escalating. Karen, I said, voice dangerously low, this has gone far enough. Her smirk grew. Oh, Sherwin, it's only just begun. Then she gently shut the door in my face again. I stood there for a long moment, my blood roaring in my ears. I had tried to be reasonable. I had tried to be civil. Karen wanted a war. Fine. She was about to find out that she picked the wrong man to mess with. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured Karen smirking at me, her SUV boldly taking up space in my driveway like a throne in her personal kingdom. My frustration had reached a boiling point, but I wasn't going to act recklessly. No, I needed a plan, one she wouldn't see coming. At 3 a.m., unable to shake the restless energy buzzing through me, I grabbed my phone and started researching. I scoured property laws, HOA bylaws, city ordinances, anything that could give me an edge. I needed a loophole, a weapon, a way to turn this power trip of hers into her own downfall. And then, I found it. A single line buried deep in city zoning regulations. A detail so small, so overlooked, that it was almost poetic. It stated that any unauthorized vehicle parked on private property without permission was considered trespassing and could be legally removed, no matter who it belonged to. I read it again and again, heart pounding in my chest. This was it. The perfect counterattack. The next morning, I stood by my window, waiting. Watching. I knew Karen's routine. She would emerge from her house at exactly 7:15 a.m., coffee in hand, to check her mailbox like she was inspecting her kingdom. She always lingered outside just long enough to gloat before heading back in. That's when I'd make my move. At 7:14 a.m., I dialed the number I had saved in my phone overnight. Citywide Towing, how can I help you? I took a deep breath, steeling myself for the moment I had been waiting for. Yeah, I have a vehicle illegally parked on my property, I said, keeping my voice calm but firm. I'd like it removed immediately. I gave them my address and hung up, stepping onto my porch just as Karen appeared down the street. She didn't know it yet. But her reign over my driveway was about to come crashing down. The tow truck arrived faster than I expected, its bright orange lights flickering against the early morning sky. I stood on my porch, arms crossed, watching as the driver assessed the situation. That the one? He asked, pointing at Karen's oversized SUV, still sitting smugly in my driveway. That's the one, I confirmed, barely suppressing a grin. He nodded, wasting no time. With expert efficiency, he backed up his truck, lowered the hydraulic lift, and got to work. Chains clinked, the steel hook locked into place, and the SUV let out a metallic groan as it began to rise. I could feel the tension in the air. This wasn't just about a car anymore. This was a statement. And then, like a storm rolling in on cue, Karen's front door slammed open. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" she shrieked, storming down her driveway in her fuzzy slippers, her robe flaring behind her like a cape of entitlement. The tow truck driver, unfazed by her theatrics, barely glanced up. "Moving an unauthorized vehicle, ma'am," he said, tightening the chains. "That's my car," she screeched, her voice bouncing off the houses. Neighbors peeked out their windows, some stepping onto their porches, drawn by the spectacle. I shrugged. "And this is my driveway." Karen's face turned a shade of red I'd never seen before. "I'm the HOA president. You can't do this." The driver gave her a bored look. HOA rules don't override private property laws, lady. With a final pull of the lever, the SUV lifted completely off the ground, dangling like a caught fish. Karen's expression twisted into sheer disbelief as she watched her precious vehicle being hauled away, her authority crumbling with it. She spun on me, jabbing a manicured finger at my chest. "You're going to regret this," she spat, her voice shaking. I leaned in just slightly, lowering my voice so only she could hear. "No, Karen," I said. "For once, you are." She stood there, speechless, as the truck pulled out of my driveway, taking her car, and her ego, with it. The HOA had ruled over the neighborhood like an iron-fisted monarchy for years, with Karen sitting atop her throne, barking orders, issuing fines, and making life miserable for anyone who didn't conform to her vision of community perfection. But today, justice had finally cracked through her carefully built walls. I stood at the front of the packed HOA meeting, the very same room where Karen had once dictated every absurd rule without opposition. Except now, she wasn't leading the meeting, she was sitting in the back, silent, seething, her nails digging into her crossed arms. The power shift was undeniable. I took a slow breath and placed a thick folder on the table. "Before we begin," I said, "I'd like to introduce some evidence." Murmurs spread through the crowd as I opened the folder and started pulling out copies. Bank statements, internal emails, and HOA expense reports, all proving what I had suspected for weeks: Karen had been embezzling community funds. Lavish dinners, spa visits, even an expensive vacation to the Bahamas, all billed to the HOA under vague, operational costs. The room fell into stunned silence. Then, a voice from the back, Elaine, one of Karen's most vocal supporters, spoke up. "Is this real?" I nodded. "All public record." I spoke with a lawyer. "This isn't just HOA misconduct, it's fraud." Karen lurched to her feet. "This is a personal attack," she screeched, but her voice cracked under the weight of the truth. This is defamation. Lies." I met her glare without flinching. "The only thing worse than a bad leader," I said, "is one who gets caught." A slow murmur of agreement spread through the room. People who had once been afraid to speak out were now emboldened. Neighbors who had been fined, harassed, bullied, they were done being silent. A motion was made: remove Karen as HOA president. The vote wasn't even close. Unanimous. Karen's face drained of color. Her reign was over. For the first time in years, the neighborhood was free. And as I walked out that door, I realized something. This wasn't just about me. It was about every single person she had wronged, finally getting the justice they deserved. The moment Karen was removed as HOA president, something shifted in the air. It wasn't just relief, it was the realization that the fear she had held over the neighborhood was gone. People were still stunned, as if they couldn't believe what had just happened. But I knew better. This wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. Karen might have lost her title, but she wasn't going to slink away quietly. Her pride wouldn't allow it. 2 days after the vote, I noticed something strange. A fresh violation notice stuck to my door. It wasn't the usual glossy HOA printout, but rather a hastily written letter, typed in all caps, signed by the concerned citizens of Maple Grove. It read: "Sherwin, you may have fooled some weak-minded neighbors, but you're a danger to this community. Your reckless actions have made things worse. Expect resistance." I gripped the paper tightly, feeling the heat rise in my chest. Karen. This had her fingerprints all over it. She might have lost the official title, but she was working behind the scenes, stirring up whatever supporters she had left. The next morning, I woke up to find someone had thrown garbage all over my front yard. A putrid mix of rotten vegetables, old newspapers, and a broken ceramic planter. A clear message. I wasn't the only one. I got a call from Elaine, her voice shaking with anger. "They egged my house last night. Michael, another neighbor who had helped expose Karen, sent me a text, "They slashed my tires. This is getting serious." Karen was waging a guerrilla war. She had lost the official power but was still rallying her minions to make our lives hell. A desperate, wounded tyrant trying to cling to control. I clenched my fists. If Karen wanted a fight, she was going to get one. But this time, it wouldn't be just me standing against her. This time, the whole neighborhood was ready. It was time to root out Karen's influence for good. Karen had spent years terrorizing the neighborhood, lording over everyone like a self-appointed queen. But now, her empire was crumbling, and she was about to experience the full weight of poetic justice. It started with the audit. When the new HOA board took over, they did what Karen never expected, they went through the books. Every fine she had issued, every so-called community expense, and every suspicious charge under her reign was scrutinized. What they found was worse than anyone imagined. Karen had been skimming funds for years. Thousands of dollars unaccounted for. HOA dues that were meant for community maintenance had instead paid for her personal vacations, expensive designer bags, and even a home security system that turned out to be an illegal surveillance setup aimed at her least favorite neighbors. The revelation spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. The same people she had bullied, harassed, and overcharged were now laughing at her downfall. Then came the lawsuit. The board filed embezzlement charges. The very rules Karen had used to fine and intimidate homeowners were now being turned against her. One by one, people stepped forward with stories of wrongful fines, fraudulent violations, and threats Karen had made to keep them silent. She had built her power on fear, and now she was the one afraid. The final blow came in the form of a foreclosure notice. Karen, so obsessed with controlling everyone else's property, was about to lose her own. With her assets frozen pending the investigation and thousands owed in legal fees, she was unable to make her mortgage payments. The neighborhood gathered the day she moved out, watching from their porches as the moving trucks came to haul away her possessions. No one helped. No one offered kind words. Karen stood there, eyes burning with rage, humiliated beyond words. Elaine leaned over and whispered, "Hey Karen, don't forget to submit a change of address form. Wouldn't want to miss any new violation notices." The entire street erupted in laughter. Poetic justice, indeed. The neighborhood was finally free of Karen's reign, but the fight wasn't over yet. The damage she had done, both financially and structurally, had left scars that needed mending. The HOA was in shambles, drowning in debt, and homeowners were still dealing with the fallout of her endless fines and fraudulent violations. The new board, led by Elaine, had inherited a mess, but they were determined to clean it up. The first step was undoing the ridiculous rules Karen had put in place. The excessive grass height restrictions. Gone. The absurdly specific mailbox color regulations. Erased. The fines for harmless things like wind chimes and seasonal wreaths. Scrapped. The community was finally taking back its freedom. But there was still one major issue, the financial black hole Karen had created. HOA funds had been drained into her personal accounts, leaving essential services neglected. Streetlights were out, sidewalks were cracking, and community maintenance had been ignored for so long that the place was falling apart. Then came the flood of refund claims. Homeowners who had been wrongfully fined or overcharged for years began demanding their money back. But with the HOA's finances in ruins, where would the money come from? That's when the audit revealed a stroke of luck. During her time in power, Karen had written a clause into her contract that entitled her to a massive severance package upon stepping down, except she had never actually filed it properly. This meant the board could legally redirect those funds into a community restoration project. And that's exactly what they did. With the money she had once tried to hoard for herself, the HOA paid back the most outrageous fines, fixed the sidewalks, and even installed a brand new park in the center of the neighborhood. Karen's stolen money was now being used to fix the very community she had tried to destroy. As the final check was deposited into the Neighborhood Improvement Fund, Elaine smiled and said exactly what everyone was thinking. Looks like Karen finally did something good for this neighborhood, without meaning to. The day Karen finally got what she deserved, the neighborhood felt different, lighter, freer. There was no more fear of surprise fines in the mailbox, no more whispering about who would be the next target of her petty power trips. Her empire of control had crumbled, and in its place, the community was rising stronger than ever. It all came to a head at the final HOA board meeting, the one where the investigation results were made public. I sat in the front row, arms crossed, watching as Karen fidgeted in her seat, her confidence replaced with barely contained panic. She had spent years weaponizing rules to bully homeowners, but today, the rules had finally turned against her. Elaine, standing tall as the new board president, cleared her throat and addressed the room. After a thorough financial audit, we have found undeniable evidence of embezzlement, fraud, and misuse of HOA funds. A hush fell over the crowd. Karen's face twisted, but she said nothing. We have turned over all findings to the district attorney's office. Formal charges are being filed. A slow murmur of disbelief spread through the room before it erupted into applause. Karen's face drained of color. She looked around, searching for someone to defend her, but even her former allies wouldn't meet her eyes. She was finally alone, just like she had made so many of us feel. Then, the final blow. Elaine pulled out a stack of signatures. In accordance with HOA bylaws, a vote of no confidence has been submitted. Effective immediately, Karen Westfield is permanently removed from the HOA, stripped of all power and authority. The room exploded with cheers. For the first time in years, the community had spoken, and it had spoken against tyranny. As Karen stormed out, her usual smugness shattered, I couldn't help but smile. This wasn't just my victory, it was all of ours. She had tried to rule us through fear, but in the end, it was the neighborhood's unity that brought her down. That night, as I sat on my porch, watching neighbors celebrate with drinks and laughter, I knew, we had won. The fallout from Karen's downfall was more chaotic than I ever could have imagined. It was like someone had ripped the mask off a long-standing villain, and the entire neighborhood was finally seeing the monster that had been ruling over them. The HOA, once a tool of intimidation, was now scrambling to clean up the mess she left behind. In the days following her removal, the board members who had backed Karen started jumping ship one by one. Some resigned out of guilt, others because they knew they would be next under the microscope of the investigation. The community meeting board was flooded with letters from residents, demanding refunds for unjust fines, reimbursement for unnecessary upgrades, and an overhaul of the entire HOA system. It was a reckoning years in the making. But Karen's influence didn't disappear overnight. She tried to fight back. News of her fraud spread like wildfire, and instead of lying low, she did what Karen did best, she played the victim. She went door to door, trying to rally support, claiming she had been unfairly removed, that this was all some personal vendetta against her. No one bought it. The same people she had harassed over mailbox colors, fence heights, and grass length slammed their doors in her face. Then, the biggest moment of poetic justice came. A lawyer from the state attorney's office showed up at her house with an official notice. The HOA wasn't just removing her, they were suing her for damages. For years of financial abuse, for misuse of community funds, and for the legal trouble she had now brought upon them all. The look on her face as she opened that letter. Priceless. That was the moment Karen truly lost. The moment she realized she had no more power, no more control, and no more allies. As I stood on my porch that evening, watching as a moving truck pulled into her driveway, it hit me, she was leaving. Just like that, her reign of terror had come to an end. And in its place, a new chapter for our neighborhood was about to begin. The neighborhood was finally free. For years, Karen had ruled with an iron fist, making life miserable for anyone who didn't bow to her ridiculous HOA dictatorship. But now, the air felt different, lighter, freer, like we had all stepped out of a long, exhausting storm and into the sunshine. With Karen gone and the HOA in shambles, the community came together like never before. The neighbors who had once whispered in fear of fines and retaliation were now openly chatting in their yards, sharing stories of their past struggles and newfound relief. People who had barely spoken before were now standing side by side, united by a common victory. At the next town meeting, Elaine, one of Karen's loudest critics, was unanimously voted in as the new HOA president, with a clear mission: undo the damage Karen had done. The first order of business: eliminating the outrageous fines and rewriting the bylaws to make them fair, reasonable, and actually beneficial to homeowners. No more nonsense about mailbox shades or the number of potted plants allowed on porches. Real change was happening. To celebrate, the neighborhood organized a massive block party. For the first time in years, the streets were filled with laughter instead of passive-aggressive violation notices. Families set up barbecue grills, kids rode their bikes freely, and for the first time ever, the community actually felt like a place people wanted to live in, not just one they had to endure. As I stood on my porch, watching everyone come together, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: peace. We had fought for our rights, stood up against corruption, and in the end, we had won. And best of all, Karen's house sat empty, a monument to what happens when a tyrant underestimates the power of a united community.